"Get in, let me take you home." Single mom helps an old man walk in the rain. The next day, his heiress son came. The rain was coming down in sheets, slapping hard against the windshield like a warning. Streetlights blurred in the downpour as Lila Thompson squinted through the streaked glass. Her old sedan groaned with every turn, windshield wipers squealing as they struggled to keep up. The hour was late, almost midnight, and the silence in the car was broken only by the rhythmic breathing of her 5-year-old daughter, Maya, curled up in the back seat in her pink dress, asleep with her small shoes dangling off the edge of the seat. Lila's blonde hair was pulled back into a low, tired knot. Her waitress uniform still smelled faintly of grease and coffee. She was exhausted, her back aching from another long shift at the all-night diner. All she wanted was to get home, dry off, and sleep for a few hours before the next day started all over again. Then she saw him. At the edge of the sidewalk, barely visible in the downpour, an elderly man stood hunched under the weight of the storm. He had no umbrella, no raincoat, just a soaked wool blazer clinging to his thin frame. One hand gripped a lamppost for balance, and the other trembled as he looked down at a phone, clearly dead or without service. Lila's foot eased off the gas. She hesitated. This part of town was quiet, but not unfamiliar. Still, helping strangers in the middle of the night was something the world had taught her to be careful about. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. But then she saw his shoulders shake, not from the cold, though he was clearly freezing, but from fatigue, maybe even fear. Lila sighed softly and pulled the car over. She rolled down the passenger window halfway. Cold rain blew in immediately. "You okay out here?" she called out. The man turned slowly, blinking through the water dripping from his brow. His voice was hoarse but calm. I got turned around. My phone died. I thought I could make it, but I am not as young as I used to be." Lila studied him. His clothes were soaked through, shoes covered in mud, but there was something dignified in the way he held himself. Not just old, but gentle, lost. She leaned over, unlocked the door, and gave a small nod. "Get in," she said quietly. "Let me take you home." He hesitated for just a moment. Then, with a slight nod of thanks, he opened the door and lowered himself into the seat. Rainwater pooled on the floor mat beneath him. Lila turned the heater up, though she knew it barely worked. The silence between them was broken only by the sound of the storm until the man spoke again, his voice a little clearer now. "You did not have to stop," he said. "I know," Lila replied, keeping her eyes on the road. "But I could not just drive past someone's grandpa melting in the rain." That earned a faint chuckle. "Walter," he said after a pause. "My name is Walter." "Lila," she responded. "And the sleeping beauty in the back is Maya." Walter turned slightly, smiling at the little girl curled up peacefully. "She reminds me of someone, long ago." They drove in silence for a few blocks before Lila asked for his address. When he gave it, her eyes widened slightly. It was in one of the most affluent neighborhoods on the edge of town. Still, she said nothing. As they approached the gated street, she followed his quiet directions until they reached a large brick home nestled behind trimmed hedges and glowing porch lights. The rain had not let up. Lila parked and glanced at the walkway. A wide puddle had formed just in front of the steps. Walter made a move to open the door. "Wait," Lila said gently. She stepped out first, dashed around the car, and opened his door for him. Then she carefully led him around the puddle, her hand under his arm to steady him. She walked him up to the front door and did not leave until she saw the lights turn on inside. Walter turned to her before stepping in. His eyes, though weary, were kind. "You never asked who I was," he said softly. Lila shrugged. Did not seem important. He smiled, deeply moved. She nodded once, then turned and walked back to her car, rain soaking her hair, the faint glow of his porch light behind her. It had been a long night, but for the first time in a while, Lila felt like she had done something right. The morning came far too soon. After getting home close to 2 a.m., Lila had only managed a few hours of restless sleep. Her bones still ached from the long shift, and the storm still echoed faintly in her ears. The soft snores of Maya in the next room were the only comforting sound as she shuffled around her small apartment, half awake. By 6:45, she was out the door again, clutching Maya's tiny hand and a pink umbrella. Maya, in her signature pink dress and matching backpack, gave her mom a sleepy smile as they walked through puddles toward the local daycare. Lila kissed her forehead, lingered a little longer than usual at the door, and then sprinted back to her car. She was already late. The diner where she worked stood on a busy corner of town, small, greasy, always a little too loud. Lila had worked there for 4 years. She knew the menu by heart, could refill coffee without looking, and had smiled through sore feet more days than she could count. She burst through the back door of the kitchen, wet hair plastered to her forehead, her uniform still damp from yesterday's storm. Her apron was bunched under one arm as she tied it in a hurry. She was 15 minutes late. "Carter!" The manager's voice snapped like a whip across the kitchen. Lila froze. Steve Simmons, the manager, was standing by the counter, arms folded tightly across his chest. His eyes were already narrowed. "I warned you," he said loudly enough for the customers to hear. "I know, I'm so sorry." Lila rushed forward, breathless. "There was this man last night. He was lost in the rain. I couldn't just—" Steve raised a hand to silence her, the corner of his mouth curling. "Save it," he said. "You think helping someone gives you a pass to stroll in whenever you like? This is a job, Carter, not a charity." She lowered her eyes. "I've never been late before. Please, it was just—" "I said save it," he barked. "You want to tell sob stories, go to church, you're done here." There was a silence. Even the sound of the sizzling griddle seemed to pause. Customers turned to look. One woman in a booth put down her fork slowly. Steve stepped forward, voice rising with theatrical flair. "You think good deeds pay bills? Lila, kindness doesn't fry eggs or clean booths. You've been warned. Get out." Her mouth parted slightly, stunned. "I've worked here 4 years." "Exactly," Steve snapped. "And in 4 years I've seen people who actually take the job seriously. Hand over your apron." Lila untied it slowly, her fingers trembling. She laid it gently on the counter, refusing to let him see her break. She turned to leave. "Wait," Steve added with a mocking grin. "Try not to be late to your next charity gig." A few customers chuckled under their breath. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Lila walked through the front of the diner, past the booths she'd served for years, past the coffee station where she always kept extra sugar for the regulars. She did not notice the older man sitting alone in the far corner booth, watching quietly behind silver-rimmed glasses. Walter Weston stirred his tea slowly, his gaze fixed not on the menu, but on Lila's retreating figure. Outside, Lila paused under the diner's awning. The sky was overcast again, her shoes were soaked through, her hands clenched at her sides. She had done the right thing last night. She was sure of it. But today, it cost her everything. Behind the glass, Walter reached for his wallet, placing a generous tip on the table. Then, without a word, he rose and walked toward the exit. His eyes followed the woman in the rain. The story was just beginning. It was nearly noon when the knock came. Lila stood at the sink, rinsing a spoon, still dressed in her faded jeans and a loose gray t-shirt. Maya was coloring quietly at the small kitchen table, humming to herself, oblivious to her mother's worn expression. The knock came again, firm but not forceful. Lila wiped her hands on a dish towel, hesitant. No one ever came by unannounced. She opened the door. A man stood on the porch, tall, early 30s, clean-cut with a calm presence that caught her off guard. He wore a navy coat, rain still clinging to the shoulders. His eyes, a shade of thoughtful blue, met hers directly. "Miss Thompson?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, cautious. "I'm Julian Weston. My father is Walter." She blinked. It took her a moment. "The man from the storm." He gave a slight smile. "That's the one." She stepped aside, unsure whether to invite him in or not. Julian didn't move forward. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, glancing past her at Maya, who was now peeking from behind her coloring book. "I just wanted to say thank you. My father told me everything. What you did for him, it meant more than I can explain." "I really didn't do much," Lila said quietly. "Just gave him a ride." Julian shook his head. "You saw someone struggling and helped without asking anything in return. That's rare." She folded her arms slightly. "Is he okay?" "He is now," Julian nodded. "But he's had a rough few months. He recently came home from a hospital stay, and truthfully, he's been quieter than usual, more distant." He took a breath before continuing. "He asked me to come find you, said he wanted to invite you and your daughter for lunch, and he hoped you might consider working with us, just part-time." Lila raised an eyebrow. "Doing what?" "Nothing medical," Julian quickly clarified. "He doesn't want a nurse. He wants someone kind, someone who'll sit with him, help with tea, maybe read to him, remind him to take his medication. Light things. He says being around you made him feel human again." Lila hesitated, glancing at Maya, then back at Julian. "I appreciate it, but I don't have the credentials for something like that." Julian's voice softened. "You don't need a degree to make someone feel cared for." There was a silence, broken only by the soft scratching of Maya's crayons. "I'd pay you properly," Julian added. "Flexible schedule, 3 afternoons a week, if that works for you." Lila looked down at her bare feet, then up again. She had just lost her job. Rent was due next week. Groceries were already getting tight. But it wasn't just the money. There was something sincere in Julian's voice, something grounded, no pity, no agenda, just a quiet offering of a different path. She nodded slowly. 3 days a week. I can try." Julian smiled, relieved. "Thank you. He'll be thrilled." From the kitchen, Maya's small voice piped up, "Can I come too?" Lila laughed under her breath. "I think we'll have to ask Mr. Walter." Julian glanced at Maya, then back to Lila, and said warmly, "I think he already has his answer." He handed Lila a small folded note, an invitation written in Walter's handwriting, elegant and old-fashioned. She held it gently, her heart unexpectedly full. As Julian stepped off the porch, he turned once more. "You gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time," he said. "Hope." Lila closed the door behind her and looked down at the note in her hand. For the first time in days, she smiled. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when Lila and Maya arrived at the Weston estate for their first visit as more than just guests. The large, ivy-covered home stood tall and elegant, but not intimidating in the way Lila had feared. The front door opened before she could knock. Walter greeted them with a warm smile, dressed in a cozy cardigan and soft slippers. "You came," he said simply, as if he had doubted it until this very moment. Julian stood behind him, his sleeves rolled up, a dish towel over his shoulder. The faint scent of rosemary and baked bread drifted from the kitchen. "I cooked," he said, almost awkwardly. Walter chuckled. "By cooked, he means he supervised the oven." Julian smiled faintly, then stepped aside and gestured. "Come in." The dining room was simple, not lavish, just a long oak table with 4 place settings, fresh flowers in a mason jar at the center. Maya climbed into her chair without hesitation, legs swinging. Julian, without a word, pulled out the chair for Lila, then gently placed a small piece of roasted chicken on Maya's plate, adding a spoonful of mashed potatoes. Lila noticed the quiet attentiveness, how he checked the temperature of the food before offering it to the child, how he poured water for everyone before serving himself. Walter watched them from across the table, eyes misting slightly. Midway through the meal, he reached across the table, placing his hand gently on Lila's. "You reminded me who I was, before the money," he said. Lila blinked, unsure what to say. Then quietly, she answered, "Sometimes all you can offer is a ride home, but it might be everything to someone." After dinner, while Maya drew pictures at the coffee table, Lila followed Walter into his study. The job began simply. She read aloud from his favorite book of short stories. Later, she helped him fold some linens, made a pot of chamomile tea, and sat beside him in the sunroom while he talked about his late wife, about raising Julian alone, about the long pauses of loneliness wealth could not fill. He listened, too, about Maya's fear of thunder, Lila's love of gardening, the nights she used to sing quietly just to calm herself. Julian returned each evening just as the sun dipped. He never interrupted, only nodded to Lila, catching her eye with a soft, silent question. How was today? She always gave a small smile in return. One evening, he passed by the open door of the study and stopped. Inside, Lila and Walter were laughing, really laughing, over a ridiculous story from Walter's youth involving a stolen canoe, a lost pair of trousers, and a furious swan. Julian stood in the hallway for a moment, unnoticed, listening. His father hadn't laughed like that in years. He turned away quietly, not wanting to disturb the peace. Maya came more often after school. She brought drawings, little pink cupcakes from the corner bakery, and endless questions for Walter, who answered each one with the patience of a grandfather. The house, once quiet and cool, had taken on a different rhythm. The scent of tea mingled with the scent of crayons. There were blankets tossed on chairs and tiny shoes near the back door. And in the stillness between their visits, Julian found himself missing the sound of Lila's voice reading from the armchair. He found himself waiting for the bell at the gate, wondering what color dress Maya might wear next, or what new joke Walter would laugh at that day. Something had changed in the air. Not all at once, but gently, steadily. And for the first time in a long time, the Weston house no longer felt like a museum of memories. It felt like a home. It was a bright Saturday afternoon when Lila and Maya arrived at the Weston estate again, this time not for work, but as guests. Julian had invited them over for a light weekend meal. Just something casual, he had said. But the way the table in the sunroom was set, fresh flowers, cloth napkins, and warm scones waiting under a linen cover, told Lila he had thought about this carefully. Julian greeted them at the door, sleeves rolled up, apron dusted with flour. "Perfect timing," he said with a soft smile. The lemonade's still cold. Maya twirled in her pink dress, the sunlight catching in her curls. She skipped inside as if she belonged there. Walter sat in his usual chair by the window, beaming as she ran into his arms. While Julian went back into the kitchen to finish the last touches on the food, Lila helped Maya out of her jacket. "Stay close to Walter, okay?" she reminded gently. Maya nodded, clutching her favorite stuffed bunny. Moments later, Maya wandered into Julian's study with Walter following slowly behind her. The room smelled of old books and cedarwood. It was lined with shelves and treasures from another time. Maya's curious eyes sparkled. On the desk stood a small wooden box, simple but polished, with tiny etchings along the side. Maya reached up and gently touched it. The lid was loose. Her fingers slipped. In one quick moment, the box fell to the floor. It cracked open, and a string of worn, greenish-blue stones scattered across the hardwood with a sharp, brittle sound. Walter froze. Maya gasped. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, eyes wide. Julian heard the sound and rushed in, drying his hands on a towel. His steps slowed the moment he saw what lay on the floor. The beads, the broken string, the empty box. He stopped mid-step. His expression shifted, not anger, but something else, something deeper. He knelt slowly and picked up one of the beads, holding it between his fingers like something sacred. His voice, when it came, was calm but low. "It's okay." She didn't know. Lila had entered just behind him, breath caught. Her eyes dropped to the floor, to the shattered bracelet, then to Julian's hands. She understood. This wasn't about the object. It was about something irreplaceable. "I am so sorry," she said softly, pulling Maya gently toward her. "We'll replace it, or—" Julian shook his head, eyes still on the beads. "It was my mother's," he said, voice rough. "She made it for me when I turned 10. Her hands were shaky by then, but she said it was from the strongest stone she could find." He placed the bead back into the cracked box and stood. The silence felt heavier than any scolding. Walter placed a hand on his son's shoulder, but Julian just gave Lila a small, tight nod. "It's all right, really." But the warmth in his voice was gone. Lila offered to help clean up, but Julian declined. "Thank you for coming," he said politely. "I should probably finish up some things." He didn't mention the food waiting on the table, didn't ask them to stay, and that was answer enough. Lila helped Maya with her coat again, her heart heavy. As they walked toward the car, Maya looked up at her mother, small voice trembling. "Mommy, did I do something bad?" Lila crouched down and wrapped her arms around her daughter. "No, sweetie," she whispered, stroking her hair. "You just didn't know. It was an accident." She didn't say more. She couldn't. The drive home was quiet. Behind them, in the house full of untouched food and fading sunlight, the broken bracelet remained on the desk, silent, small, and full of memory. It had been 4 days since Lila last stepped foot near the Weston estate. She had texted Walter that morning after the accident, her message careful and apologetic. "I think it's best you find someone else to assist you, Mr. Weston. Maya didn't mean to, but I understand that what she broke can't be replaced. I'm sorry. I truly am." Walter didn't reply right away, and when he did, it was only 2 words, "You matter." But Lila still didn't return. Julian had read the exchange on his father's phone. He didn't blame her, not really. But the silence in the house since they left had settled in like fog, thick and unshakable. The house was too quiet. He found himself looking toward the garden window at the exact time Maya used to arrive. He noticed things he hadn't before, how the light in the hallway felt colder without the sound of her laughter, how the dining room table stayed set but unused. Walter noticed it too. One afternoon he said gently, "You've been staring out that window for 20 minutes, son." Julian shrugged, not looking up from his coffee. "Just thinking." It rained that afternoon. A steady, thoughtful kind of rain that tapped softly against the glass like a question. Meanwhile, in their small apartment across town, Maya sat cross-legged on the living room rug, threading small plastic beads onto a stretchy string. Her tongue stuck slightly out as she concentrated. Lila watched from the kitchen, heart aching at the sight. "What are you making, honey?" Maya didn't look up. "Mommy said we can't fix the old bracelet," she said quietly. "But maybe I can make him a new one." Lila knelt beside her, eyes soft. "You don't have to, sweetie, it wasn't your fault." Maya kept threading. "But he looked so sad," she whispered, "and I want to make him smile again." When the bracelet was done, a messy, colorful loop of mismatched plastic beads, Maya held it up proudly. Then she grabbed a scrap of paper and a purple crayon, writing in big, uneven letters, "I'm sorry I broke your shiny bracelet. I made this one for you. It's not shiny, but it's full of love. Love, Maya, 5 years old." Later that evening, they knocked on Walter's front door. Not Lila, but Walter, returning the favor. She opened the door cautiously. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Maya asked me to bring this," Walter said gently, handing her a small paper bag. Inside was the bracelet, and the note folded gently on top. Lila blinked back sudden tears. "Will you give it to him?" she asked softly. "I will," Walter promised, and turned back into the misty evening. Julian sat alone in his study when Walter entered. Without a word, he placed the bracelet and note on the desk in front of him. "What's this?" Julian asked, glancing up. Walter only smiled and nodded. "From someone who still believes broken things can be made whole again." Julian opened the note first. The handwriting was wobbly, the lines uneven, but he read every word slowly. By the time he reached "It's full of love," his hands trembled slightly. Then he looked at the bracelet, colorful, plastic, imperfect, and perfect. He sat back in his chair, the bracelet cradled in his hand like something sacred. A single tear slid down his cheek before he could stop it. The grief that had lived quietly in him for years shifted. For the first time, he wasn't crying because he missed his mother. He was crying because love, pure, undeserved love, had walked into his life again, through a child who did not owe him anything. It was dark when he arrived at Leela's apartment. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and rain. She opened the door, surprised. "Julian?" He didn't wait. He gently took her hand. "I was angry," he said. "Not at Maya, not even really at the bracelet." He looked her in the eyes. "It was important. But people are more important." She didn't speak. "I missed you," he added. "Both of you." A small pair of feet padded softly down the hall. Maya peeked from behind her mother, eyes wide and hopeful. Julian crouched to her level, pulled something from his pocket, and held up her plastic bracelet. "I am wearing it tomorrow," he said, smiling, "and every day after that." Maya grinned and threw her arms around him. Lila couldn't help it. She cried. This time, it was not from guilt, not from fear. It was from the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they were already home. The rain returned on a Sunday afternoon, soft, steady, and warm like a memory. It tapped gently on the wide windows of the Weston estate as gray skies cast a cozy glow over the home that, not long ago, had felt far too big for its silence. Now it was full again. In the backyard, damp but not muddy, Julian, Lila, and Maya sat on a picnic blanket, looking up at the clouds through the gentle drizzle. Walter watched from the patio, a book resting on his lap, his eyes lingering on the scene before him more than the pages. Julian leaned back, one arm draped behind Lila, his other wrist catching the light, still wearing Maya's homemade plastic bracelet. The bright beads stood out against his button-down shirt and leather watch, but he wore it like something priceless. Maya giggled, pointing upward. "That one looks like a dragon." Julian squinted. I see a bunny with a really long tail." "No," she laughed, falling back into Lila's lap. Walter smiled faintly from his chair. He had not seen his son like this in years. They stayed like that for a while, just being. The kind of moment no one talks over, because it's too good to break. Then Maya sat up and scooted next to Julian. Without a word, she rested her head gently on his shoulder. Julian stilled for a moment. Then he reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. The rain slowed to a whisper. And then, quietly, Maya asked, "If we stayed here forever, would you be my daddy?" The question dropped like a pebble into still water, soft, but impossible to ignore. Lila froze. She opened her mouth, ready to gently scold her daughter, but the words never came. Julian turned slightly to look at the little girl beside him. Her eyes were wide but not uncertain. She meant it. He smiled, not out of amusement, but from something deeper. He cupped her small cheek with his hand and said softly, "That would be an honor." Lila blinked fast, swallowing the lump in her throat. Maya grinned and hugged him tight. Later that evening, as the sky turned from silver to a muted purple, Julian drove Lila and Maya home. The streets shimmered under the glow of wet streetlights, the car silent but full of something unsaid. When they reached the apartment, Lila opened the door, but Julian didn't let go of the steering wheel just yet. He looked over at her, his voice low. "You know," he said, "you two didn't just walk into our house. You brought it back to life." Lila turned to him, A little breath caught in her chest. "I think we needed each other more than we realized," she whispered. Julian nodded, then looked in the rearview mirror. Maya had already fallen asleep, her head leaning softly to one side. He turned back to Lila. "See you tomorrow?" She smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." As Lila carried Maya up the stairs, Julian watched them disappear behind the apartment door. The rain had stopped, but in his chest, something deeper had just begun to pour, not sadness, hope. The dining room glowed under soft amber lights, laughter rising like music from the long, wooden table. The Weston home, once so still and formal, now echoed with warmth. Friends and family gathered, plates full, glasses raised, stories exchanged between bites and memories. Walter sat at the head of the table, a gentle smile playing on his lips as he looked around, at the joy, the chatter, and most of all, at the woman and child who had turned this house into a home again. Lila sat beside Julian, Maya nestled between them, happily munching on breadsticks. She wore a sparkly clip in her hair, a gift from Walter earlier that evening. Julian, still wearing the rainbow-colored bracelet she had made, looked at her like she was magic. When the meal was nearly finished, Walter gently tapped his glass with a spoon. The room quieted. "I know we usually save toasts for holidays or weddings," he began, voice steady but full of feeling. "But tonight is special, because my son has found something rarer than wealth. He's found a family." Lila's hand paused on her napkin. Maya looked up. Julian lowered his gaze, a faint smile curving his lips. Walter lifted his glass. "To Lila and Maya, for reminding us all what really matters." Everyone raised their glasses. "To Lila and Maya." Lila blinked fast, eyes shimmering. Julian stood up slowly, taking her hand in his. The room fell quiet again. He looked at her, his voice sure and soft. "You walked into our lives during a storm. You helped my father when no one else would. You brought light into a place that had grown dim." Lila's lips parted, her breath caught. Julian continued, "You changed our lives. Let me spend the rest of mine making yours better." A pause. Then, "Say yes, Mommy." Maya's voice rang out like a firecracker. Laughter erupted around the table. Lila looked down at her daughter, then up at Julian, her hand still in his eyes steady and full of something deep and true. Tears spilled freely as she nodded, unable to speak. She pulled Maya close with one arm and reached for Julian with the other, all three wrapped in one embrace. The guests clapped, glasses clinked again, and Walter wiped at the corner of his eye with a handkerchief he pretended not to need. Later that week, as twilight stretched long shadows across quiet streets, a silver car pulled up to a modest, sun-washed house with a garden gate and ivy climbing its porch railings. Julian stepped out and opened the passenger door. Lila stood on the sidewalk, holding Maya's hand. He looked at her, smiling. "Get in," he said. "This time, let me take you home." Lila tilted her head, smiling through her tears. "You sure this ride comes with snacks and bedtime stories?" Julian chuckled. "Only if you sit up front." She laughed, climbed in, and Maya hopped into the back with a squeal of delight. The car door closed with a soft thud. The engine hummed as they drove slowly up the winding lane. As the car faded into the driveway, the camera slowly pulled back, wide, gentle. The three of them walked toward the front door, hand in hand, silhouettes against the golden light spilling through the windows. Above them, the clouds parted just enough to let a sliver of sunlight through. The storm had passed, and in its place was something whole. A real home, built not from walls or wood, but from kindness, forgiveness, and love. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey. Sometimes, all it takes is one simple act of kindness, one ride home in the rain, to change the course of a life, or three. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the goodness that still exists in unexpected places, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories. Hit that hype button to show your love and help us share more stories that inspire, heal, and bring people closer together. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never underestimate the power of a single, selfless choice.